Thanks, Steve. We're really happy to have the opportunity to hear from Mary Kosuth tonight. Mary is a professor at Dunwoody College and a PhD student at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health in the Environmental Health Sciences Division. She's done research on microplastics, and she can share her insights into the connection between plastic and climate change. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. It's a little bit weird when people use the word professor to describe my job at Dunwoody. It's not how I regard it, but in any case, let me share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so as Lori had mentioned, my name is Mary Kosuth. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota in the School of Public Health, Environmental Health Sciences Division. Before I entered graduate school, I'd spent 15 years teaching environmental science classes at Dunwoody College of Technology. But I entered the microplastic contamination field in 2016, kind of when the interest was just on the cusp of skyrocketing. And I published a study in 2018 that involved international salt, regional beer, and global tap water. Currently, I'm working on wrapping up a methods paper. Let me catch up here. Wrapping up a methods paper and working on a project that involves wastewater mitigation. But some of my favorite projects deal with urban atmospheric deposition, which is why I have my friend taking a selfie with my Moody Nano 2, which is an impactor to test the atmosphere for microplastics, as well as long-range transport and fate of contaminants and consumer products. So I want to kind of start off talking a little bit about the history of plastic. I'm sure many of you have heard of the name Leo Baekeland, who invented the first true synthetic polymer in 1907 called Bakelite. If you want to know what this early plastic felt like, you can kind of imagine a bowling ball or one of those old-fashioned telephones. It was originally meant to replace shellac, which is a natural resin that comes from the sticky excretion of a lac beetle. But it takes something like 15,000 female lac beetles laboring for 6 months to produce a single pound of this resin. So at this point in time, the Industrial Revolution had been chugging along for 150 years, and we were finding out that nature really couldn't keep pace with increasing demand for materials. Industrialists were really quite desperate to find materials that were cheap and easy to mass produce. Other than the lac beetle probably being relieved at the invention of plastic, there was a couple other species that were probably initially relieved by it as well. One of them was the elephant, just because high-end billiard balls used to be made from the tusks of elephants, but synthetic polymers really changed that. The hawkbill sea turtle, now critically endangered, used to supply wealthy people with tortoiseshell combs and hair pieces and other adornments, but this too was replaced by plastic. In the 1930s, a comb cost maybe about $1, but by the 1940s, the machine molded combs were only 10 to 50 cents a piece. Bakelite might have been the first true synthetic polymer, but nearly 40 years before that had debuted, a fellow named John Wesley Hyatt invented a material called celluloid, which you've probably also heard of. It just means like cellulose because it's made from a natural polymer, which is the cellulose of cotton. So that kind of makes it a semi-synthetic polymer like rayon. I wanted to include this image though, because it nicely illustrates how plastic products ended up replacing things that were once considered luxury items that only an elite class could enjoy. So things like a fountain pen, a refillable lighter, or maybe a shaving razor, these were all transformed into things that nearly anyone could afford. And more importantly, when they were no longer needed, the individual could afford to toss them out. Although this new material was being produced before 1941, World War II really pushed polymer chemistry into the mainstream. Production quadrupled from 213 million pounds in 1939 to 818 million pounds in 1945. It was used, of course, to make the combs and the soldiers' hygiene kits, but it was also used for mortar fuses, parachutes, aircraft components, antenna housing, bazooka barrels, enclosures for gun turrets and helmet liners, And when the GIs came home from the war, imagine all of the plastic items that they could buy to fill their suburban homes. During the peak year of the baby boom, annual toy sales leapt from 84 million in 1940 to 1.25 billion in 1960. And by 1947, 40% of those toys were made of plastic. These figures, by the way, came from a book called A Plastic, A Toxic Love Story by Susan Frankel. I'm looking at my stack of books here. And I've got a little bibliography at the end that I can share with you. I kind of tossed this in as well because it seems, we'll talk a little bit more about bioplastics at the end, but I thought it might be worth mentioning because we're talking about World War II now. So the first bioplastic car, believe it or not, came out in 1941. The shortage of metal from the war inspired Ford to look for alternative materials. The fuel of this car was hemp oil, and there were some parts made from soybean bioplastics. The frame was steel, but the body was made of plastic components, and the windows were made out of acrylic. It was about 1,000 pounds less than its all steel counterpart, but it never really caught on because after the war, we didn't have to conserve as we did when the war was going on, and fossil fuels were scaling up due to demand, especially in personal motor vehicles. So this kind of goes along with that. So now we're looking at a study that came out in 2019 from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, but they corroborate these historical industrial landmarks when they were sifting through 200 years of sediment off the coast of California in the Santa Barbara Basin. So a team led by Jennifer Brandon found microplastic contamination starting in the 1940s and doubling nearly every 15 years since then. So what about the children of the World War II servicemen, the baby boom generation? So for those of you that are too young to recognize this screenshot here, it's actually from a scene from a movie that came out in 1967 called The Graduate. And here Dustin Hoffman's character just graduated from college, and he's being pulled aside by a family friend and told that the future is in, are you ready for it? Plastic. So unless you're my parents' age, you probably don't understand the joke here, because by the time the movie came out, plastics were no longer new or exciting like they were in the 1920s. So this would be equivalent to pulling aside a 2021 college grad and telling them that the future is in social media or computers, right? We already know that. So they're pretty well established at this point. So even though the material was no longer terribly new or showy, through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there were all kinds of ways that Americans were learning to use and love plastic. Susan Strausser wrote a book called Waste and Want, where she meticulously documents the transition from an era of reusing and saving and really squeezing the life out of every object to an era where convenience is made the top priority. In her book, she reminds us that for most of American history, we were doing things like feeding food scraps to domestic animals, making candles from tallow, and trading goods with ragmen and peddlers who would go door to door as members of a robust informal waste sector. Waste, she asserts, is really a 20th century phenomenon. The ethos of reuse was so deeply ingrained that even as late as the 1950s, when vending machines were dispensing coffee in plastic cups, people tended to save them at their desk and reuse them multiple times. And I just think it's important to point out that we really had to learn to be a throwaway culture. It wasn't something that's somehow innate. Yeah, and this is a cover of Life magazine in 1955. The authors of the article claimed that cleaning the non-disposable versions of these cups and utensils and plates would have taken 40 hours for any housewife, but now no housewife need bother. So in a way, the disposable items were becoming a mark of modern living. But again, this is something individuals had to learn to embrace. I want to look at another example here, which is the plastic bag. This is what industrialists refer to as the t-shirt bag, just because of the way that it looks. The patent drawing surprisingly came out as early as 1962. The inventor was a Swedish fellow, but it did not emerge in US grocery stores until 1976. And guess what? Shoppers didn't care for them. It turns out they didn't like how the checkout clerks had to lick their fingers to pull one bag free from the rest on the rack. And they also didn't like how the bags wouldn't stand upright like a paper bag when set down or when trying to pull things in and out of it. So we really had to learn to love them, because at the time, and still in many places, grocery bags were an internal cost to supermarkets. When I was in high school, I worked at Terran's Market in Duluth, and people would often buy maybe one small bottle of dish soap and ask me to put it in a plastic bag. And what did I care? I was making $4.35 an hour, and my boss was paying for the bags. So those plastic bags cost a penny or two to my employer, while paper bags cost 3 or 4 times as much. Because the paper is heavier and bulkier, they were also more expensive to transport and to store. So from a grocer's perspective, plastic was the way to go. Safeway and Kroger made the switch to plastic in 1982, and most of the other chains soon followed afterwards. Worldwide, people use somewhere between 500 billion and 1 trillion bags a year, more than 1 million a minute. The average American was taking home about 300 a year. So I can't travel back to 1976 to see what shopping looked like before single-use plastic bags were the norm, but I did live in China in 1987 when there were really no plastic shopping bags. We would go to the open market and buy things in bulk. My brother and I used to get yogurt each day in these ceramic mugs sealed with a paper lid. You can see them on the right. And then we would return them empty and buy new ones. And the people who made the yogurt would wash them out and refill them with a new product and sell them the next day. And this is exactly what the company Coca-Cola used to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when I moved back to China in 2004, everything that you could dream of was put in plastic bags. I would see workers on the street at 6 a.m. eating hot savory tofu soup out of a plastic bag. I happen to live in Qingdao, which is where they brew Qingdao beer, and they would sell it by the gin, which is a unit of weight. So they would pipe the beer into a bag, and then they would have a hand scale, and they would charge me by how heavy it was. And then they would give me the bag, and I would take it home on a bus. I'm not ashamed to say I did this a couple times. And then when I got home, I would just hang it on a doorknob. So yeah, there were all kinds of things sold in bags. But in 2008, China implemented a national ban on plastic bags from retailers. According to Shanghai, the Shanghai Daily, the ban saved 67 billion plastic bags over a span of 5 years. I'm not really sure what the impetus was for the Chinese government to take such swift action, but it did happen overnight. Another city, I just have this in here in my notes. The city of Mumbai actually, they banned plastic bags in 2000, and their reason is because the plastic bags were getting caught in storm drains and dramatically worsening monsoon floods. So I'm not sure what was going on with the Chinese government, why they decided to make this change, but it was very quick. Continuing on with plastic bags, but now looking at the United States, here in the city of Minneapolis, where I live, our city council members voted in 2016 on an ordinance to ban plastic bags in order to encourage the use of reusable ones. The vote was 10-3 in favor of the ban. However, before the ordinance was supposed to take effect a year later, the Minnesota legislature decided to get involved in local politics and put a ban on any city bans of plastic bags. So as you can see from this map, Minnesota is not the only place that has decided to ban bag bans. The states in blue have bans on plastic bags, and the states in red have bans on local plastic bag bans. In an effort to circumnavigate this, Minneapolis leaders decided to turn the ban into a 5-cent bag fee, which did go in effect in 2019 in January. I actually recall walking to my local grocery store the day it went into effect, and I was so happy that I lived in a city that valued reducing unnecessary waste enough to really keep pushing for this change despite the political obstructions. And I distinctly remember asking my store clerk, a woman about my age, how things were going with the bag fee. And she said, I quote, I remember this, "People are angry about it and they're taking it out on me," which was really disappointing to hear, because I felt like, this is my grocery store, this is my neighborhood, and these are my neighbors. And I don't think that they fully understand the consequences of our linear manufacturing and convenience-oriented lifestyle. So there really ought to be more information out there. This kind of brings me to something I've been thinking a lot about lately. In going through the decades since World War II, we see that people had to learn to embrace this new material. And then once we're very used to it, we have a hard time giving it up. People are getting angry about having to pay for a bag that used to be free, except the cost was just an external cost to the shopper. So shifting baselines is, again, a term I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Traditionally, it was used to describe the expectations of one generation based on their direct experiences, but it doesn't take into account the larger historical context. For example, parents or grandparents used to tell their children or grandchildren that the fish used to be bigger or they used to be more plentiful in the past. I actually find myself telling my children who are ages 8 and 12 that, it's October 18th. It's usually doesn't feel like summer on October 18th, or forest fires weren't this bad when I was your age, But if you don't say these things to the next generation, they'll just assume that supermarket shelves always looked like this. So this applies to plastic because we've seen massive changes in the way that plastic use and waste has occurred just in a single generation. So in the 1960s, my father was 12 and the average American consumed about 30 pounds of plastic a year. Today, my son is 12 and we're each consuming about 300 pounds of plastic a year. A few years ago, I had a very young student from Dunwoody come up to me after class and tell me how concerned he was about climate change and waste, the waste we produce. And while he was talking to me, he was holding the single-use Starbucks plastic cup with a lid and a straw. And despite the irony of that moment, I really have zero judgment for this individual because it only shows how plastic has become so ubiquitous and so enmeshed with our lives that it's virtually invisible. We don't really even see it anymore. Which brings me to another anecdote I want to share. So back in 2007, I spent a few nights in a yurt camp about 60 kilometers outside of Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital of Mongolia. And it had, I think, only 1 million people living in the capital at that time, which maybe was half of the entire nation's population, right? So I took a picture that looked like this. And that first morning I was there, I was very jet lagged. So I woke up really early and I decided to take like a sunrise walk across the Mongolian steppe. And so there really wasn't very much light when I first started walking. But then as dawn broke, I started noticing these glistening specks all over the field. And I honestly thought they were wildflowers at first, but then I soon realized it was actually weathered plastic film snagged on the forbs and sedges. And I might have walked a mile, and then when I made my way back, I gathered up the shreds just as I walked in the line. And by the time I returned to camp, my arms were full of this fluffy weathered plastic. And I ran into the yurt camp director, who looked at me as though I had brought a wild animal back. And she asked why I had picked up all this trash. And I honestly didn't have a good reason. So we just sort of stared at each other awkwardly for some moments. But I'm remembering this because 8 years after this experience, there was a study about microplastic pollution in a remote Mongolian lake, 200 miles southwest of Lake Baikal. And these findings really shocked people in the West because at the time, we had only just learned about microplastic contamination in Lake Erie, in Huron, and Superior, and it was particularly high in Lake Erie. But we can kind of allow for that because, mentally maybe because it's surrounded by large cities and industries. So we think of a place like Lake Khazgol in Mongolia as far away from densely populated human settlements. But when I reflect on it, maybe it wasn't terribly shocking to local residents. I don't know. But maybe just like us, plastic became just such an integral part of your daily landscape that you don't even register it until some tourist shows up with her weird, naive expectations about pristine environments. This story kind of came to mind too, when I read an opinion piece that was published by a fellow named Marcus Erickson, who was actually the lead author in that paper about the Great Lakes. So his paper actually led to the Microbeads Free Water Act. And he said that when we think about plastic pollution, if we think about it at all, we tend to think of it as a marine environment problem. But as he and his colleagues found in Dubai, some 2,000 plastic bags crammed inside of the body of a dead camel, it really plagues all environments. So global production of plastic was about 359 million metric tons in 2018. This graph's a little dated. It's actually probably closer to 400 million metric tons now, which is a lot more than the initial, the 30 million metric tons that we had in 1970. This is production. And since 2010, the production has increased about 3 to 4% a year, which in itself is rather stunning. Currently, that's something like 83 pounds of plastic per person. However, this figure from Plastic Europe doesn't even include fibers made of polyethylene terephthalate, also known as polyester, polyamide, and acrylic fibers. So over the past decade, the production of synthetic fibers has increased at a much higher rate, about 6.6 to 7% annually, with some 60 million metric tons produced in 2016. So these estimates here really are conservative, and at least they're not the entire picture. So in summary, oops, I think I went a little too far. Plastic has surpassed all other human-made materials except steel and cement, and it's projected to grow another 40% in the next decade as developing countries start to adopt the single-use, convenience-oriented lifestyle of the developed world. There are a lot of elements that are contributing to the dominance of plastic, but one of the most important is that they come from fossil fuels, which are have a very well-established infrastructure, which makes them incredibly cheap. Today, about 70% of plastics made in the United States are derived from natural gas and about 30% from oil. And the reverse is true in Asia and Europe, where natural gas prices run a little higher than oil. Roughly 5 to 6% of the world's annual oil production, the actual material, becomes feedstock for plastic manufacturing, and another 4% of fossil fuel energy is used to transport and produce the plastic itself. I also want to impress on you how far our local circular economy, described in Susan Strausser's book, where materials stayed in local communities and were seen as an asset or a resource, into an international trade in goods, including waste. So when we buy something, I don't know that we fully appreciate, I certainly don't think about this every time I purchase something, how the complicated and torturous path that the raw materials make before they end up as a product that you consume. So the extraction can happen in one place while the construction and assembly happens somewhere else completely. For example, in the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong province in China, some 50,000 factories occupy an area about the size of Missouri. About 1,800 of these factories deal exclusively in plastic goods, with twice as many people working in the plastics industry there than the entire United States. There are half a dozen wholesale resin markets in this area, but they don't get their pellets from China. Instead, they import them from the United States or Mexico or the Middle East. Of course, once those goods, including an estimated 80% of toys, are manufactured in this area, they're shipped overseas to markets all over the world. But what happens to these goods when they're no longer useful? Before January 2018, 95% of the plastic collected from the EU and 70% of the plastic sold collected in the United States was actually sold and shipped back to China. And this was happening because China's contamination standards were pretty low, which means we didn't have to invest a lot of money and resources into sorting the plastic, and their prices were very competitive. However, in 2018, China enacted what has been called the National Sword Policy, where shipments now have to be 99.5% pure. And as a direct result of this change, the US started shipping its low-grade recyclables to other Asian countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. In addition, huge amounts of plastic from the developed world are either piling up or they're getting burned. For example, in 2019, Australia had 1.3 million ton stockpile of recycled waste just hanging around until they could figure out what to do with it, while England just decided to burn their 500,000 tons of recyclable waste. So our global trade systems allow us to buy goods on international markets, and when those goods turn to trash, we sometimes sell them back to the very nations that were involved in making them. And I'm bringing these things up because I think it's important to recognize that we operate in a global economy and we share global commons like the ocean. These images I took when I was at a conference in Santa Barbara, and I didn't stage any of this. This is just the beach in California where you get this beautiful kelp and then kind of some other surprising things coming out of the ocean as well, like a deodorant stick. The quote actually comes from Bill McDonough, who was a co-author of a book called Cradle to Cradle. And I think it's an important quote because it really binds us together in this problem. This is really something that's going to take collective action to solve. Okay, so before I talk about microplastic pollution, I want to first talk a little bit about definitions. What are microplastics? So in this field, we tend to use the term synthetic polymer to describe the contaminant of interest. Polymer just means many parts. So if you can imagine a chain made up of repeating units like a beaded necklace, this is a monomer of PET. It's one unit. But when you link them together with other monomers, you end up with a really long chain that actually looks more or less like cooked spaghetti. And what you get are a bunch of strands that come together, and they're sometimes organized in these sort of crystalline regions, and sometimes they're disorganized in these more amorphous regions. And very often it's a mixture of both, but each one sort of has its own physical attributes like flexibility or rigidity. And nature makes all kinds of polymers like silk and cellulose and wool and your DNA, but synthetic polymers are totally human-made. You're never going to stumble upon a wild patch of neoprene while going on a hike in the woods. So again, synthetic polymers are made from petroleum products, and that's really important in the definition. Oops. Okay, so I also want to talk about, I want to define micro. In order to talk about microplastics, we have to understand the size that we're talking about. To be considered a microplastic, the piece actually has to be smaller than 5 millimeters, which means it's going to be about the diameter of the width of a pencil eraser. I'm looking for something here, you know, so I don't know if you can see this, but 5 millimeters. Technically, micro is something that's less than 1 millimeter, but I was told by my research advisor that marine law actually forbade the dumping of waste larger than 5 millimeters. So scientists initially included up to 5 millimeters in their studies. There's actually no official lower size limit. Originally, scientists were describing 1 millimeter particles, which is maybe the width of the sharpened tip of a pencil. But as science advances, the size range of interest gets smaller and smaller. For example, if we look at the sharpened end of a pencil and we slice it up into 1,000 even pieces, each of those pieces would be a micron. And if you take that micron and chop it up into 1,000 pieces, each of those would be a nanometer. And that's where a lot of the research is focused on these days. It's generally understood that the larger chunks of plastic gradually break down into finer and finer particles over time, which intuitively makes sense. If you're going to imagine an abandoned fishing line or a fishing net in the ocean subjected to mechanical degradation from the waves and the chemical degradation from UV exposure, it gets ground down into smaller bits. And depending on your instruments or your sampling method, you may or may not capture these very small bits. So this is a plankton net, which is used to gather samples on the surface water. And the finer the mesh of the net, the more stuff you're going to capture. But if the pores are very large, then you might miss a lot. And that's important. Size matters because, well, I'll get to that in a moment, but in 2014, there was a research team led by Obard et al. The lead investigator was Obard, and she was one of the first to find microplastics in Arctic sea ice. And it was actually an accidental discovery because the research team wasn't looking for microplastics. They were looking for diatomaceous life, because that's the kind of thing you would find in Arctic sea ice. But upon examining the ice cores, they stumbled upon these really brightly colored fibers and fragments, and they really felt compelled to report on it. So this graph here actually shows the result of a second Arctic sea study that took place 4 years later, and they had a much lower size threshold. Most of what they found, as you can see here, is below Obard's lower size limit of 250 microns, which is highlighted in the blue box. So clearly the first study really underestimated contamination. And why is this important? Well, abundant size, surface area, all of this information is needed when it comes to assessing environmental and human health concerns. For a few years, the particles found in the guts of fish were not terribly alarming because at least here in the United States, we don't often eat the entrails of fish. But in 2017, 2 studies came out. One was in the Persian Gulf and the other was in Indonesia. And these 2 investigations examined the muscle tissue of fish. So how did we get to the point where we were looking through fish muscle tissue and even human placenta to see if it contains microplastics? So it didn't start with those studies, of course. It actually started way back in the 1960s. So we're going to just take a brief jaunt through the history of plastic contamination research. And like I said, started in the 1960s when biologists were finding plastic debris in the guts of marine birds known to dwell in remote parts of the world, like this unfortunate albatross. But the first papers that really reported plastic pollution directly in marine environments actually came out in 1971, where Buchanan found fibers and large fragments in the North Sea. And the following year, Carpenter and Smith reported plastic pellets and fragments in the Western Sargasso Sea. The research on plastic pollution in marine environments continued kind of just slowly through the 1970s and 80s, far below the public radar, until 1997, when a guy named Captain Charles Moore elevated what is now thought of as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is kind of now a household term, I think. He didn't coin the phrase himself, but he's done a lot to make people aware of marine plastic litter. He wrote this book that came out in 2011, and as you can see here in this graph, even though there was rising public awareness, research was still lagging. So here's 2012, 2011, 2012. This is just an example of what you get when you do a literary search using microplastic or macroplastic. So it really kind of took off only very recently. We've since learned that plastic pollution is far more ubiquitous than we previously thought. The Mariana Trench, for example, some 10,898 meters below the ocean surface, contains plastic debris. Other studies have found them inside benthic or bottom-dwelling organisms. This diagram on the left is from Obard's paper. And then this is one of two chunks of macroplastics, some polystyrene found during an expedition in 2017 on an ice floe several hundred miles from land. We have since learned, let's see, oops, sorry. Okay, so these are some of the studies that involve liquid freshwater. The image on the left came from Austin Baldwin's work. He worked for USGS, and he found plastic in all 107 samples of river water taken from 29 Great Lakes tributaries. And his work really came on the heels of the study where the image on the right was produced. And this was the freshwater study in 2013, where plastics were found in 21 trawls of Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior. And the mean density was something like 43,000 particles per square kilometer. And then in 2014, a study involving 24 German beers found synthetic polymers in every brand tested. In 2015, a Chinese study found microplastics in 15 brands of domestically sourced table salt. So before these two studies, honey was really the only terrestrial human consumable that had ever been tested. And this is why we here at the U of M decided to examine beer and salt in our study. We wanted to know if microplastic contamination was just a problem in German beers and Chinese salts, or if they were a problem everywhere. So even though we had probably several hundred papers at this point in time showing microplastic contamination in marine organisms, this was sort of a pivotal moment when people started making the mental leap from, oh, so there's plastic waste in the ocean, to wait a second, I eat things out of the ocean. So after 2014, you start seeing papers with titles like Microplastic in Bivalves Cultured for Human Consumption, or Anthropogenic Debris in Seafood, Plastic Debris and Fibers from Textiles and Fish and Bivalves Sold for Human Consumption. Another unexpected place that it was cropping up was ambient or outdoor air, as well as indoor air. Paris, France was the first metropolitan area studied in 2015. Several of the studies followed a couple of years later. One was in Dongguan, China, which I'd mentioned, just north of Hong Kong, and another was in Tehran, Iran. There were several more in 2019, one in London, several in Shanghai. And these findings maybe weren't terribly shocking because these cities are home to 8.3 to 26.3 million people. And we could probably expect pollution to be relatively high in places where human populations are very dense. But what was more surprising was the fact that microplastic debris was found in relatively remote places, like the Pyrenees. That same year, another study found them in snow from the Fram Strait in Svalbard, Norway, which is this image up on the upper right-hand corner here. So the Fram Strait is the little box that's in red, and Svalbard is in yellow. It was also found here in the United States, again by accident, in 8 sampling stations between Boulder, Colorado, and Denver. And I say by accident, that's what these images are down here, because the sampling stations were actually not set up to capture microplastics, they just happened to capture them. There was a more intentional study that was published in 2020 showing microplastics in 11 Western national parks and wilderness areas in the United States. And then just last year, it was found on the balcony of Mount Everest, which is the sort of official resting spot right before summiting the mountain. And that's over 8,000 meters above sea level. Back to food and beverages and consumer products, because I kind of have a bias when I'm doing searches online. There's just some more interesting papers that have come out more recently. In 2020, a study involving 8 brands of milk all had plastic particles in them. And all of the types were actually, but there were only 2 types, surprisingly, found in the milks. And both of those were involved in the filtering apparatus that's used in milk production, which just goes to show that some of the processing itself can be contributing to contamination of food. There was a study from McGill University. It was something of a media sensation, and they estimated billions of micro and nano sized particles in a single cup of tea that uses a plastic mesh bag for steeping. In Italy, both wild and farmed snails were tested. In rural Mexico, soil, worm castings, chicken gizzards, crops, and feces were also tested. Nori or seaweed sold for human consumption was tested in China. Cat and dog food, as well as cat and dog feces, were analyzed here in the North America. Microplastics were found in all 42 metro stations that had drinking water fountains in Mexico City. And another study involved white wines corked with synthetic stoppers. There are many studies of salt, but the latest one involves salt mills that have 2 plastic grinding components. Oops. So I just have a couple more studies to share with you. This one is one of my favorites that I read one of the first days I started this program. So this brilliant study came out by Caterino et al. They were looking at wild and farmed mussels off the coast of Scotland. And based on their results and the consumption of mussels in the UK, they came up with something like 123 microplastic particles from mussels alone each year, which is actually not, as far as all the mussel studies have gone, that's on the lower side. But this study also left out petri dishes for 20 minutes during food preparation and 20 minutes during food consumption, and found that the atmospheric fallout is several orders of magnitude greater. Some 13,000 to 68,000 microplastic particles are consumed each year through the just the food preparation and the time that it takes to consume the food. Another fabulous contribution, I suppose, to this field, Francesca DeFalco worked on microplastic in textiles, washing machines and that sort of thing, for her PhD dissertation centered around that. And she found that 400 fibers per gram of clothing could be shed just in 20 minutes of some normal activity like walking. And again, that's 400 fibers per gram of clothing. That's not 400 fibers per article of clothing. Another study investigated chicken. This is kind of related to that last study. The reason why I kind of stuck it in there just at the last second. Looked at chicken that's wrapped in plastic film and polystyrene. And they found that the quantity of fibers on the surface of the plastic was much higher than the quantity of fibers between the plastic film and the meat. So when you think about Caterino's study, this plastic film is doing an excellent job keeping the fibers out at the processing plant and at the home until it's opened up. But they also found particles of expanded polystyrene on the meat. So there's kind of a trade-off between these 2 forms of packaging. On the one hand, you decrease fallout. On the other hand, you might be eating little bits of polystyrene with your chicken. A 2020 study looked at 3 different kinds of never used straight from the factory polypropylene packaging. And when you look at something like this that you might get from the grocery store, you think just looking at it with the naked eye, that it looks completely smooth, but everything changes once you look at something under a scanning electron microscope. You can see tiny little particles that are ready to be shed. A 2019 study examined plastic particles released from repeated mechanical stress on plastic bottles, like opening up the bottle cap and working on the bottle itself. This was likely carried out after a few studies had shown that bottled water had microplastics in it. And then there was a third study that quantified plastic release when packaging is cut with scissors versus a knife or torn by hand. And again, this just shows how plastic has become so integral in our lives that we barely even see the sources, even when they're right under our noses. And if we're trying to reduce exposure, know that we're going to have blind spots. I mean, when I was processing samples for the 2018 publication, I was also making ice for my very own children in this plastic ice cube tray that's visibly cracked and chipped. This last spring, I ran filtered water, ran a brief experiment just looking at the amount released from the plastic ice cube tray. And you can see that the tray had a much higher quantity than the blank that I ran. Okay, so I think it's important to point out that plastic contamination goes hand in hand with climate change. Sorry, that's kind of an abrupt shift that I made there with no transition. But they are linked because both problems are rooted in fossil fuels. So although plastic currently makes up only a small fraction of the possible fossil fuel products, it appears to be a very sensitive area for the industry, probably because they're projected to be the biggest new demand for oil in the near future. So according to an article that was published by Vox, BP expects plastics to represent 95% of net growth in demand for oil between 2020 and 2040. More broadly, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, different from the EIA, they project plastics are going to be the biggest single source of demand growth, representing 45% of the total. This is probably also why the Plastics Industry Association, which is a trade organization representing a multi-billion-dollar plastic industry, wrote letters to the US Department of Health and Human Services in 2019 during the pandemic, asking for a public statement to support and promote single-use plastic bags, containers, and cups, and treat them as though they were health and hygiene tools, and to oppose any state or municipal restrictions on these convenience-oriented items during the pandemic. So they really twisted the science and made spurious claims, probably because they were quite desperate. I mean, think about how COVID-19 put a dent in the fossil fuel industry's profits during that year. So when we think about plastic in terms of climate change, what are the external costs of producing, of manufacturing plastic? Both extraction and transportation of fossil fuels are carbon intensive activities. This is actually a picture that I snapped in a train yard near a bike path on my way to the U of M. The authors of a report published by the Center for International Environmental Law estimates 12.5 to 13.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted each year while extracting and transporting natural gas to create feedstocks for plastics in the United States. So this has been studied. Land disturbance also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions associated with extraction. About 19.2 million acres have been cleared for oil and gas developments in the US. And if you assume only 1/3 of that, of the impacted land is forested, that ends up being 1.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide released. Plastic refining is also greenhouse gas intensive. In 2015, emissions from manufacturing ethylene were 184 to 213 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is the same as about 45 million passenger vehicles running for an entire year. Also, CO2 emissions from ethylene production are projected to grow and expand 34% between 2015 and 2030. And then what happens with plastic waste? Globally, less than 9% of the plastic waste is recycled. And of the products that are recycled, only 2% are recycled into products with the same function. The remaining 7% are downcycled into something of lower quality, like a park bench. So 9% of it is recycled, 12% is incinerated. US emissions from plastic incineration in 2015 were 5.9 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Based on projections from the World Energy Council, if plastic production and incineration increases as expected, greenhouse gas emissions will increase by 49 million metric tons by 2030 and by 91 million metric tons by 2050. not to mention the fact that incineration is generally a huge social justice issue with incinerators, commonly built in poor, politically disenfranchised communities. So what's happening to the remaining 79% of the plastic waste if it's not recycled or incinerated? It's either intentionally landfilled or else it ends up in oceans. A 2017 paper from Ocean University in China found that microplastic reduces the growth of microalgae. And this biomass plays a critical role in sequestering 30 to 50% of carbon dioxide emissions from human-related activities. So producing microplastics could degrade the plankton's ability to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that is also very concerning. One more thing about recycling in air quotes, I highly recommend, Laura Sullivan did a report in Planet Money called Wasteland. It was all about the recycling myth. The journalists sifted through boxes of files donated by an industry consultant to a library in Syracuse University and found a report that was sent to top oil and plastic executives in 1973, essentially saying, we can't recycle this stuff. It's not economically feasible. They've known this for 50 years. She also found confidential memos, one that said that they have serious doubts that it can ever be made viable on an economic basis. So essentially what they did is they've been spending $50 million a year on ad campaigns promoting plastic because it's cheaper than making this, this stuff actually recyclable. And quite frankly, it works for them because if the rest of us think that the stuff is recyclable, we'll just continue to use it instead of question it. I want to just talk very briefly about this climate change. I know we're kind of getting low on time, but this fellow, the larger picture here is a guy named Ben Santer. He was the recipient of a 1998 MacArthur Genius Award. He's a very accomplished scientist, and he's also the author of kind of infamous Chapter 8 of the IPCC's 1995 report, where humans, for the first time, were publicly called out for their role in climate change. He was accused by a group of physicists led by Fred Seitz and Fred Singer, the smaller pictures, and they were both tied to a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., and accused him of doctoring a report to make the science seem firmer than it really was. But more publicized than that was an op-ed piece that was published in the Wall Street Journal in June of 1996, where Santer was accused of making changes to deceive policymakers and the public, which is, it's true that Santer had made changes to the report, but the changes were not meant to deceive anyone. He was merely responding to the review comments of his peer community, which is how science works. Peer review is an essential part of the scientific process. And so he was essentially being attacked for being a good scientist. All of this, his entire story is really nicely laid out in a story, a book called Merchants of Doubt, if you're interested in learning more about it. So I'm not Ben Santer. I would never compare myself to him, but I just got the tiniest taste of the tactics that are used to undermine scientists when I wrote an editorial earlier this year about the plastic industry's manipulation of science during the pandemic. And I know you're never supposed to read the comments, but this one time I did. And this is just a little excerpt here. So this anonymous person claimed to be a scientist, but you can say really anything on a message board. And they shamed me for my grave factual error of saying petroleum products are used to make plastics when I should have said natural gas. And then this person goes on to explain, in case anyone failed to see their motive, that my credibility as a scientist has been immeasurably compromised. What was frustrating is that I was really trying to set the record straight and cite some sources like from Plastic Europe, which is a trade organization that supports the use of plastic, or from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which has been around for a minute, to kind of educate people and let them know that natural gas is actually a part of petroleum or crude oil. I very intentionally used that word, but my responses were ignored, which I suppose is fine because some other people hopped in. How much time do I have? I know I can kind of skip through some of these or.
Well, we're at about 7 minutes too. So yeah, if you could wrap up in just a couple minutes.
Okay, I can do that. Yeah. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about bioplastics other than to say that they are out there and they hold some promise, but there's a lot of logistical problems as far as making them really have the impact that they're intended to have, which comes down to things like sorting. And I do want to say, many people, when they hear about microplastic contamination, want to know what they can do personally to cut down on consumption, because according to Plastic Europe, almost 40% of plastics go into making packaging or single-use items. So there are a lot of things you can do that you can buy, but you have to keep in mind that paper bags need to be used 3 times, and a cotton bag might need to be used 131 times before their global warming potential is lower than a typical plastic grocery bag. And I carry around my bamboo cutlery. We've got metal straws, we use reusable bags. But I feel like in the developed world, we sometimes reflexively want to solve the problem with our pocketbooks. And sometimes we do, sometimes that's effective, but I wouldn't put all of your activism eggs in that basket alone. So while I love my solid shampoo that has very little packaging and my bamboo cutlery, I think the more challenging thing that we all need to do is just think about consuming less in general. And another thing that's really important than any kind of activism that you can participate on an individual consumer level, which also includes just kind of getting through personal shame and guilt about this and the judgment of others, is organized political action. And one of the most promising bills we've currently seen is the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act that was introduced in March of this year. The last point here shifts from local, this just kind of bulleted point shows what the bill is trying to do. And the last one I think is really important, shifts costs from local taxpayer funded governments to manufacturers instead and incentivizes recycled goods. This is what Coca-Cola once did when it packaged all of its beverages in glass bottles. They would wash and rinse the bottles and then refill them with product, just like my yogurt cups in China. But once PET bottles were invented, Coke and other companies could really centralize their manufacturing and externalize the packaging, the cost of their packaging, to us, the consumer and the taxpayer. Because who mails their plastic bottles back to Coke? Maybe we could all do this, or what would be easier than that is just calling our representatives and telling them to support this bill, as it would require companies to kind of turn that model around. Whoops. Not promoting Coke. Okay, so in closing, think of all the efforts that go into pulling petroleum out of the ground. Think of the political, economic, and environmental risks that we take to get this material out of the ground. Does it really make sense to just dump it in a landfill after using the bag for 10 minutes? So my last thought here is an optimistic one. An orb spider will take 2/3 of its own web to make a new one. So how can we as humans model our manufacturing and construction after the orb spider? How can we design materials and manufacture products with recycling and total life cycle in mind at the beginning? Here are some of the books that I mentioned if you want to learn more about them. And yeah, that's everything.
Well, thanks, Mary. If you could stop sharing your screen, we'll have a few questions that came in through the chat, and others, if you would like to ask a question as well. Either just type in the chat you want to ask a question, or type your question into the chat. And starting with, well, I asked a question about the UN. Is the UN getting involved at all with the international, on an international level, to reduce plastic waste in the ocean? Is there anything going on there?
Yeah, that's such a great question. There is work there. I was thinking of this because when I first started in 2019, there was a report that actually came out from the UN looking at global tap water, which is not related to marine health necessarily, but they kind of said, yes, that stuff is there, but we have so many other pressing issues, and we just don't know enough yet about it. So I guess I can't say specifically, since I'm more focused on consumer products and other sources. And we're landlocked here in Minnesota. I don't actually know specifically what the UN is doing with plastic waste in the ocean.
Okay.
But maybe I could find out and get back to you.
All right. Another question about feeding shredded plastic packaging to pigs.
Whoa.
Have you heard of that? Is that something?
No.
Okay.
That is news to me. I mean, pigs will eat a lot of different things, but I'm pretty sure plastic is not something we want to be feeding them. Yeah, that's news to me.
And then a question about cornstarch as a viable alternative to plastic bags. What's your thought on using biomaterials versus petroleum-based?
Yeah. Okay. So that's something I didn't quite get to in the presentation. Because I had to go through that section a little quicker, but there are bags that can be made out of sugarcane and cornstarch, and they are bioplastics in that they're made. The feedstocks are made from agricultural feedstocks, but they're not necessarily biodegradable. So there's this, you have to kind of learn about each product, and they're going to have some pros and cons. And another issue that you have to consider is that already there's such an enormous proportion of corn that is being used to make ethanol, and so there's competition in the markets for those types of things. So the entire life cycle analysis would have to be done to make sure that it's not contributing to global climate change in some secret other way. But yeah, that's a great point.
And then there's a question here about how concerned should we be about nanoplastics for our health?
Yeah, and this is also something I didn't include in my slides, but there are three main concerns when it comes to public health, when it comes to plastics. One is the absorption of harmful toxins on the plastic particle itself. It has the ability to sort of kind of act like a magnet and concentrate some of these things so that if you were to ingest it, you would have more than you would normally. And then another thing is the endogenous chemicals that are actually in the plastic itself that leaches out. And then the third is the size. And so there have been studies that that involve animal studies that involve feeding, mammals nanoparticles of polystyrene, and they do find that the nanoparticles can certainly migrate through tissue with ease. Particles have to be smaller than 150 microns to be able to get through our digestive system. But as far as inhalation, they would have to be a little small. I think 50 microns is sort of the cutoff there. But honestly, there's just isn't enough research to say unequivocally how it's affecting us yet. We just know that it's there. That's definitely something that we can say we're certain about.
Right. And, just thinking plastics are fairly inert when, for the most part, unless they're going to leach out. And if they just pass through, then it's not a huge problem. It's when they get stuck into different systems, like inhale into our lungs or get lodged into a different kidney or liver or something like that would be.
I read a paper once that talked about, not to make anyone paranoid about this, but when I read it, I couldn't get back to sleep again. But like joints that are made out of plastic, some of them actually little particles were migrating up to lymph nodes. So it's just that kind of thing where, we should kind of study that maybe a little bit more, just to make sure that we're not doing more harm than good.
Right, and then another question, more of a general question, would people be more upset about plastic contamination if they realized that microplastics were in their pets?
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question. Some of you maybe would know more than me. People can be very protective of their pets. And there was a study that looked at microplastics in cat and dog feces. So it's been studied. Yeah.
So I have a more general question about recycling. I've done a lot of studies, looking at how recycling goes. And you mentioned 9% of our consumer plastics get recycled. It's higher in Europe. It's closer to 40% in Europe.
That's true.
What do you think there's any value? There's any way the U.S. could do something that would be of value in plastics recycling, or is it really just a whole waste?
It's not, okay, it's not a whole waste. Personally, I think that that we have a design problem where we're just like, people are coming out, industry is coming out with all these different types of copolymers, and there's no, we're not thinking about recycling when we're designing the product. And I think that's what needs to happen. And so, you know, as far as getting that going, you know, does government need to get involved, or do we make enough demand for, you know, thinking of the end of the life cycle, and making a true circular economy instead of all of this downcycling? I mean, for now, PET and high density polyethylene are still more coveted than glass and paper in recycling. So keep recycling your milk cartons and your PET bottles, you know, your pop bottles, the clear plastic ones. You can look the ones in, is it ones and twos or ones and threes? I forget. But yeah, those are still valuable. It's just all of the other types of plastic. It's pretty confusing. And we have optical sorters, you know, here in Minneapolis at Eureka Recycling, but not every municipality has those because they're expensive to buy, you know. So I think there's all along the chain, there are ways that we can kind of improve all of this, but it's going to take, yeah, some coordination.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people don't realize is that there are regulations against using recycled plastic back into food packaging, which it gets downcycled into picnic tables and you know, composite decking and so forth. Right. You know, I think I've seen that Coca-Cola is doing like 3% or something like that, and Nestle in that range. They got like a variance from the FDA because of the rigorous recycling process that they have, that they can use some post-consumer recycle into their bottles, but it's very, very little, and hardly any of it goes into anything else. And it gets upcycled into, or downcycled into, you know, durable goods. So the main source of waste plastic is food packaging, but it can't go back in there.
Right. Right? Yeah, and there really, there was a paper that looked at all the different types of plastic specifically for food packaging, and the authors were really trying to find out what chemicals were in the food packaging, and they had such a difficult time because there's so little transparency. You really have to be an industry insider to know what's going into it, or like a super sleuth. It's very hard for any of us, just regular consumers, to know what's in our packaging.
Right. All right. Any other questions? I don't have the big view up. If okay, so Paul Gardner gave us a link to a private sector initiative to look at the in Asia to reduce ocean plastics. That's great. A question here from Jen. Can you recommend any journals for recycling or plastics news?
I mean, most of the journals that I read are the really boring types. I'm trying to think of, I mean, are you thinking of, this is a softball question. I should know the answer to this. Sorry, I just had my, I don't really.
More on like a consumer basis, like plastics news, or?
The Story of Stuff, I think, would be a good place to start.
That there's a YouTube video that's been around for 10 years called The Story of Stuff, right?
Yeah, and they have a lot of great kind of it's a nice clearinghouse of resources, I think.
And
very trustworthy.
And Paul, thanks for there's another link in the comments for recycling news. This resource-recycling.com.
Oh yes, yeah, I used to tell my students about that. That's a good one.
Okay. All right. Well, we're 8 minutes past the hour. And Mary, I really appreciate you. It was a fantastic presentation. It's obvious that you've done a lot of research in this area, and you're very prepared to talk to us about it. It was very informative. We really appreciated your presentation and the information that you brought to us. Very informative.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for letting me talk about this and geek out about it. Like I said, it sure beats chemistry homework.
Yeah. Well, actually, I teach chemistry at St. Thomas.
Oh
And tomorrow I'm talking about recycling.
Oh, fabulous. Okay.
So
I'm fine about the really applied stuff. It's just the stuff that's really niche.
yeah. So I'm doing I teach chemistry for engineering majors.
Fantastic.
I'll be doing my recycling talk tomorrow. So I'm looking
That's
forward.
awesome.
Perfect timing.
Yeah. Great.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks everyone else for joining and for tuning in to our October event, Northeast Metro Climate Action. Check out our website and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Right. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.